Close your eyes and imagine you're standing in a medieval castle. Can you feel it? The cold seeping through your bones, the dampness clinging to your skin, the overwhelming stench of human waste and rotting food filling your lungs with every breath. Now open your eyes to the truth, because everything you think you know about castle life is a carefully constructed lie. There were no shining knights, no romantic feasts, no fairy tale endings. Just disease, starvation, political backstabbing, and the constant terror that today might be the day an army appears on the horizon. The nobility who lived in these stone fortresses weren't living in luxury, they were surviving in what amounted to militarized prisons, where a single mistake could mean death, where winters could kill you as surely as any sword, and where the people who served you might be plotting to poison your next meal. Tonight, we're tearing down the fantasy and walking through the reality of medieval castle life, and I promise you, it's far more brutal, far more desperate, and far more human than any story you've been told. If you're ready to see history without the filter, hit that like button and subscribe. We're diving deep into the parts of the past they don't teach in school, the raw, uncomfortable truth. Share this with anyone who still thinks they'd want to time travel to the Middle Ages. They might change their mind. Let's begin by destroying the very first illusion, the one that makes all the others possible. Medieval castles were not homes. They were not palaces. They were not romantic settings for courtly love or chivalric adventures. These structures were purpose-built military installations, and that purpose was singular and desperate, survival in an age when violence was the default state of human interaction. Think about what it means to live in a building designed entirely around the assumption that people will try to kill you. Every feature, every architectural choice, every stone placed upon stone was a response to that threat. Those thick walls that look so impressive in photographs. They weren't aesthetic choices. They were barriers between you and death, and they needed to be thick enough to withstand siege weapons hurling boulders at them day after day. The windows, those narrow, slit-like openings you see in castle walls, they weren't designed to look medieval. They were arrow loops, wide enough inside for an archer to shoot through but narrow enough on the outside that an enemy arrow would have almost no chance of making it through. Living behind these windows meant living in perpetual darkness. Most rooms existed in a twilight gloom, illuminated only by expensive candles or smoky torches that filled the air with eye-watering fumes. Now consider the staircases. In almost every castle, the spiral stairs turned clockwise as you ascended. This wasn't random. It was tactical. Most swordsmen are right-handed, which means their sword arm is on the right side of their body. An attacker climbing up would have the central stone column on their right side, restricting their ability to swing their weapon. A defender coming down would have the open space on their right, giving them full range of motion. Every step you took in your own home was a reminder that someone might be trying to kill you on those very stairs. The castle itself was a statement written in stone: we are surrounded by enemies. And the psychological weight of that reality never lifted. You woke up inside walls built to keep people out. You ate your meals in rooms designed for quick evacuation if the walls were breached. You slept in chambers where the bed could be moved to block the door if assassins came in the night. This wasn't paranoia, this was Tuesday. Let's talk about comfort, or rather, the complete absence of it. The Great Hall, where the lord held court and the household gathered, was typically the only heated room in the entire castle. And that heat came from a central fire pit that sent most of its warmth straight up through a hole in the roof, leaving everyone to huddle as close as possible to the flames while cold air poured through every crack in the stone walls. Stone is an excellent building material for defense. It's terrible for comfort. Stone absorbs cold and holds it like a sponge holds water. Touch those walls in winter and your hand might actually stick to the ice-covered surface. The temperature inside was often barely warmer than outside, sometimes colder because at least outside you had sunlight. People slept fully clothed, under piles of furs and wool blankets, and still woke with frost in their hair. Those romantic canopy beds you see in movies? The canopy wasn't decorative. It was a desperate attempt at insulation, a fabric box to trap your body heat and keep you from literally freezing to death while you slept. People died in their beds from the cold. Not during sieges, not during harsh winters, just regular winters, the kind that came every single year. Privacy was a concept that didn't exist. The modern idea that you could have a space that was yours alone, where you could close a door and be by yourself, would have seemed bizarre to medieval people. Servants slept on the floors of the rooms they served. Multiple families shared single chambers. Even the lord and lady of the castle had guards, attendants, and servants in their rooms at all times. You were never alone from the day you were born until the day you died. Most castles weren't even particularly large. The massive fortifications we see in movies and video games were rare exceptions: royal castles, strategic strongholds, enormous investments of resources. The typical noble's castle was a modest structure where 30 or 40 people lived stacked on top of each other in a handful of drafty, dark, damp rooms. Imagine sharing a small apartment with 40 people who never leave, who you can never escape from, who will be there when you wake up and there when you go to sleep, every single day of your life. The castle was simultaneously your protection and your prison. When danger came, you couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. You retreated behind those walls and hoped they would hold. Hoped your supplies would last. Hoped the enemy would give up before you starved. The walls that kept your enemies out also kept you in, and the castle became a trap, a stone box from which there was no escape. This was the foundation of castle life. Not romance, not adventure, but fear crystallized into architecture. Every room, every corridor, every design feature was born from the desperate need to survive in a world that wanted you dead. And everything that came after, the disease, the hunger, the political backstabbing, all of it happened within these walls of fear. Now we need to talk about something that every romantic depiction of medieval life carefully avoids: the smell. If you could somehow time travel to a medieval castle, before you saw the tapestries or heard the sounds of daily life, you would be staggered by the stench. It would hit you like a physical wall, so overwhelming that you'd struggle not to vomit. We're not talking about a mild unpleasant odor. We're talking about a concentrated assault on your senses, the combined reek of unwashed human bodies, rotting food, animal waste, human excrement, spilled alcohol that had soaked into wooden floors, smoke from inadequate ventilation, and the sour smell of damp stone covered in mold and mildew. All of this trapped inside stone walls with tiny windows, fermenting and intensifying until the very air felt thick with filth. Let's start with the most fundamental problem: human waste. Medieval castles had garderobes, a polite French term that meant guard the robes, based on the theory that the ammonia from human excrement would keep moths away from expensive clothing. In practice, a garderobe was a tiny room with a wooden seat and a hole that dropped straight down. Where did it go? Sometimes into the moat. Sometimes into a cesspit dug into the castle's foundation. Sometimes, and this is genuinely horrifying, it just ran down the exterior wall, leaving a permanent stain of human waste on the outside of the castle. Imagine using this toilet. In winter, freezing wind screams up through that hole, hitting your most vulnerable parts with ice-cold air. In summer, the smell rises up like it's being pumped through the opening, bringing with it swarms of flies that had been feeding on the waste below. And you're sitting there, trying to manage your business while flies crawl on your skin and the stench makes your eyes water. But here's the thing: having access to a garderobe meant you were important. Most people in the castle didn't have that luxury. They used chamber pots, which were then emptied by servants. Emptied where? Sometimes into cesspits, but often just out the nearest window. Yes, really. Medieval records are full of complaints and even lawsuits about people dumping chamber pots from upper windows onto people passing below. The castle courtyards were perpetual swamps of mud mixed with human and animal waste, requiring wooden planks laid down to cross without sinking into the muck. Every time it rained, this toxic soup would flow into corners, into doorways, into the lower levels of the castle itself. The smell in the courtyard during summer was so intense that people held cloths soaked in herbs or vinegar over their faces just to cross from one building to another. Inside, the floors were covered with rushes, basically dried grass and reed spread to provide some cushioning and to soak up spills. These rushes were supposed to be changed regularly. In reality, they might stay down for months, accumulating everything that fell into them: spilled food, drink, vomit, dog feces, tracked in mud and waste, dead insects, bones from meals. When they were finally removed, the smell released would be overwhelming. One observer described old rushes as containing an ancient collection of beer, grease, fragments, bones, spittle, excrement of dogs and cats, and everything that is nasty. Animals lived inside the castle walls. Horses in stables, expensive warhorses that couldn't be left outside where they might be stolen. Dogs roaming freely, their waste adding to the general filth. During times of threat, livestock would be brought inside the walls: pigs, cattle, chickens, all of them contributing their waste to the enclosed space. The animal smell alone would be intolerable by modern standards. And then there were the people themselves. Bathing was rare, not just because it was difficult but because medieval medical theory held that bathing was actually dangerous, that it opened your pores and let disease in. People might go months without a full bath. They wore the same clothes day after day, wool and linen that absorbed sweat and oil and never really got clean. Multiply that by 40 or 50 people living in close quarters, and the body odor alone was staggering. The kitchens were their own special nightmare. Meat hanging in the heat, beginning to rot before it could be cooked. Blood and entrails from butchering animals, slick on the stone floors. No refrigeration, no real understanding of food safety, just people doing their best to prepare food in conditions that would shut down any modern restaurant in minutes. Servants regularly vomited from the smell and the sight. It was so common it barely rated a mention in castle records. Disease bred in these conditions with terrifying efficiency. Every surface was contaminated with bacteria that medieval people couldn't see and didn't understand. Water drawn from wells was often contaminated by seepage from nearby cesspits. Food was prepared by people who never washed their hands because the concept of washing your hands before cooking didn't exist. The entire castle was a breeding ground for pathogens, and everyone living there was constantly exposed. People tried to cope. They scattered herbs among the rushes: lavender, rosemary, mint, hoping to mask the smell. The wealthy carried pomanders, perforated metal balls filled with strong spices, which they held to their noses when the stench became unbearable. The fact that people who lived in these conditions needed special devices to tolerate the smell should tell you everything about how bad it really was. This was normal. Not a crisis, not a temporary situation during a siege, but everyday life. Every breath you took reminded you that you were living in your own filth, with no real way to escape it. Let's destroy another cherished myth: the medieval feast. Yes, extravagant banquets happened. But they were rare, expensive displays of power designed to intimidate rivals and impress allies. The rest of the time, the vast majority of the time, even nobles ate monotonous, barely adequate meals while living with constant anxiety about whether food would last until the next harvest. A castle couldn't just order groceries when supplies ran low. Every single calorie consumed within those walls had to come from the surrounding lands, and medieval agriculture was shockingly inefficient. Crop yields were poor. Transportation was limited to what could be carried by cart or pack animal over terrible roads. Weather could destroy an entire harvest in a single storm. One bad season, and people starved. It was that simple. The castle's survival depended entirely on its storerooms. Deep cellars where grain was kept in wooden chests, barrels of salted meat and fish stacked against walls, root vegetables piled in the darkness. These supplies were constantly monitored, carefully rationed, and zealously guarded. The castle steward who managed these stores had one of the most stressful positions imaginable. Make a mistake in your calculations, and people die. Run out of food too early, and everyone starves. It was that stark. And mistakes were common. Maybe the harvest came up short. Maybe rats got into the grain stores, and castles were absolutely infested with rats, massive populations of them living in the walls, the cellars, anywhere they could hide. Maybe refugees from a nearby village arrived fleeing bandits, suddenly adding dozens of extra mouths to feed. Maybe the Lord decided to extend his stay with his full household instead of traveling to his other properties. Whatever the cause, supplies that seemed adequate could become desperately insufficient with frightening speed. When food ran short, rationing became severe. Bread, the absolute foundation of the medieval diet, would be stretched with whatever could add bulk: ground peas, beans, even sawdust or chalk mixed into the flour. Meat disappeared from meals. Even nobles might find themselves eating hard bread and thin soup, day after day. Servants and lower status residents faced genuine starvation, their rations cut to almost nothing while they continued performing backbreaking labor on empty stomachs. But even in times of relative plenty, the diet was mind-numbingly repetitive. Bread, ale, pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables and grains were available, sometimes with a bit of salted meat if you were fortunate. The same meal. Every day. For months. For years. The human body needs nutritional variety, needs vitamins and minerals from diverse sources. Medieval people suffered from scurvy, night blindness from vitamin A deficiency, and malnutrition even when their stomachs were full because the food itself was nutritionally inadequate. Fresh food was available only during late summer and early fall. For the rest of the year, for most of the year, everything was preserved. Salted, smoked, pickled, dried. And medieval preservation techniques were primitive and often failed. Meat went rancid. Grain developed mold. Fish rotted. But you ate it anyway because wasting food was not an option. You choked it down and hoped the strong spices would mask the taste of decay enough that you could keep it in your stomach. The bread itself tells a desperate story. In bad years, lower quality bread might be made from rye contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. People knew this bread was dangerous. They had seen what it did to people. They ate it anyway because the alternative was starvation. Even the white bread enjoyed by nobles was coarse and gritty, contaminated with tiny fragments of the millstone that ground the grain, slowly wearing down everyone's teeth until even young adults had mouths full of broken stumps. Meat, when it appeared on the table, typically came from animals that were sick, old, or injured. The healthy livestock were far too valuable for breeding to be slaughtered for food. You were eating the culls, the cow that was lame, the pig that was failing, the chicken that had stopped laying eggs. And in times of real desperation, dogs, cats, rats, anything with calories became potential food. There are documented cases of people during sieges drawing lots to decide who would be killed and eaten. Water was dangerous. Contaminated by seepage from all the waste we talked about earlier. Everyone drank ale instead, weak ale called small beer, with just enough alcohol content to kill some of the bacteria but not enough to cause intoxication. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Everyone, constantly, from morning until night, because drinking the water was likely to give you dysentery and kill you. Imagine never drinking clean water in your entire life. Winter was when the food situation became truly desperate. All fresh food was gone. Stored supplies dwindled month by month. Each meal was a little smaller than the last as the steward tried desperately to make the food stretch until spring. People grew thin, grew weak. Children's growth was stunted. The elderly died. And everyone knew that if the winter lasted longer than expected, if spring came late, if the stores ran out before new crops could be harvested, mass starvation was inevitable. Even death wasn't the worst of it. The psychological torment of never knowing if you'd have enough food tomorrow, next week, next month, that constant anxiety was its own form of torture. Every meal might be your last adequate meal. Every bite of bread came with the knowledge that the supplies were finite and diminishing. Food wasn't pleasure. It was survival, rationed day by day, with the specter of hunger always looming. Now we need to confront something truly horrific: disease in the medieval castle. And when I say disease, I'm not talking about occasional illness. I'm talking about constant, endemic sickness that killed with casual regularity, especially children, and for which medieval medicine had essentially no effective treatments. Start with the obvious: living in the conditions we've already described, the filth, the contaminated water, the close quarters, was a perfect recipe for disease transmission. Every surface was covered in bacteria and parasites. Every drink of ale, every bite of food, every breath of air carried potential pathogens. And medieval people had no concept of germ theory. They couldn't see the microscopic killers breeding all around them. Childhood was essentially a gauntlet of death. Infant mortality was staggering. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before their 5th birthday. And these weren't just numbers. These were real children dying in agony from diseases we can now prevent or cure easily. Dysentery that caused them to waste away. Smallpox that covered them in festering sores. Measles that burned through castle populations, killing the young and weak. Scarlet fever. Diphtheria. Whooping cough. Parents knew their children would probably die. They had to emotionally prepare themselves for it. Some historians argue that medieval parents deliberately didn't form strong emotional bonds with very young children because the pain of loss was otherwise unbearable. Imagine that, loving your child less so it hurts less when they die. And they did die, over and over, in every family, in every generation. The adult population wasn't much safer. Tuberculosis was endemic, slowly destroying lungs over years of chronic coughing and blood-tinged sputum. People called it consumption because it seemed to consume the body from within, leaving victims skeletal and pale before they finally drowned in their own lung fluid. There was no treatment. You just wasted away while everyone watched, knowing they might be next. Dysentery was a constant threat, causing severe diarrhea that could kill through dehydration in days. Remember, this is an age where the primary treatment for most conditions was either prayer or bloodletting, deliberately cutting people open to drain blood based on the insane theory that disease was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors. Medieval medicine wasn't just ineffective, it was often actively harmful, weakening patients who were already fighting for their lives. And then there was the plague. The Black Death that swept through Europe in the 14th century killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the population. But plague didn't just hit once and disappear, it came back in waves, again and again, for centuries. Living in a castle offered no protection. The fleas that carried the plague lived on the rats that infested every castle. You could close your gates against an army, but you couldn't keep out the disease already living in your walls. When plague hit a castle, the results were catastrophic. People developed enormous swellings in their lymph nodes, buboes, that turned black and leaked pus and blood. They burned with fever, became delirious, coughed up blood. And they died, usually within days, in absolute agony. The smell of death became so pervasive that people held herbs and flowers to their faces constantly, desperately hoping that bad air wouldn't infect them too. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Servants refused to touch the dead for fear of infection. Families abandoned dying members, fleeing to other parts of the castle or trying to escape entirely, often carrying the disease with them. The psychological horror of watching people around you die one by one, knowing you might be next, knowing there was nothing anyone could do, it broke people mentally before it killed them physically. Childbirth was its own form of Russian roulette. Women faced a roughly 1 in 50 chance of dying with every pregnancy. Over a lifetime of multiple pregnancies, those odds accumulated terrifyingly. Childbed fever, infection of the uterus after giving birth, killed countless women in the days following delivery. Medieval midwives had no concept of sterilization. They examined women with unwashed hands, used unclean instruments, and had no antibiotics when inevitable infections took hold. Women died of hemorrhaging when the placenta wouldn't detach or the uterus wouldn't contract. They died when babies were positioned wrong and couldn't be delivered. They died of eclampsia, of infections, of complications that modern medicine handles routinely. Every pregnancy was a potential death sentence, and women knew it. They wrote wills before going into labor. They said goodbye to their families. They prepared to die. Other diseases were endemic but less dramatically deadly. Parasitic worms infested intestinal tracts, causing chronic pain and malnutrition. Dental decay was universal, everyone's teeth rotted in their heads, causing constant pain and infections that could spread to the jaw and brain. Skin diseases festered in the unclean conditions. Lice infested everyone's hair and clothes, carrying typhus. Venereal diseases spread unchecked with no effective treatment. And medieval medicine's response to all of this? Prayer. Bloodletting. Applying poultices of herbs and animal dung. Drilling holes in skulls to let out evil spirits. Treating symptoms based on completely incorrect theories of how the human body worked. The best medieval physicians were marginally better than nothing, and most people couldn't afford even that level of care. Living in a medieval castle meant watching people around you sicken and die constantly. It meant knowing that you were always one infection, one plague outbreak, one difficult childbirth away from death. It meant accepting that your children would probably not survive to adulthood, that you yourself might die young from something completely preventable, and that when death came, it would likely be painful, lingering, and unstoppable. Now let's talk about the people who made castle life possible but who are almost entirely absent from our romanticized visions, the servants. These weren't employees who could quit if they didn't like their jobs. They were essentially property, living in conditions that make everything we've discussed so far seem mild by comparison. The servant hierarchy in a castle was complex, ranging from relatively high-status positions like the steward or marshal down to the absolute bottom tier of scullery maids and stable boys. But even the higher-status servants were completely at the mercy of their lord. They had no rights, no recourse if they were abused, no ability to leave. They were born into service, would die in service, and their children would inherit their positions. Start with the numbers. A modest castle might have 20 to 30 servants. A large castle could have 100 or more. These people did everything. They cooked, cleaned, hauled water, emptied chamber pots, tended fires, cared for horses, served meals, washed clothes, maintained weapons, worked in gardens, and performed countless other tasks that kept the castle functioning. The labor was constant, backbreaking, and unending. A scullery maid's day began before dawn. She would start fires in the kitchen, haul water from the well, trip after trip carrying heavy buckets upstairs and through corridors, begin preparing breakfast, clean the dishes from the previous night that had been left soaking in cold water. Her hands would be permanently damaged from constant immersion in water, from harsh lye soap used for washing, from the heat of fires and cooking pots. She might be 12 years old. She would work until after dark, sleep on the kitchen floor or in a cramped servant's quarters, and wake up the next morning to do it all again. Stable boys slept in the stables with the horses, in conditions we wouldn't force on animals today. They mucked out stalls, hauled feed, groomed horses, and were kicked, bitten, and trampled regularly. In winter, they might actually be grateful to sleep near the horses because the animal body heat provided warmth that wasn't available anywhere else. Servants who worked in the great hall or in personal service to the lord and lady had slightly better conditions but lived under constant scrutiny. Every action was watched, every mistake noticed. Drop something, spill something, serve something incorrectly, and the punishment could be severe. Beatings were routine. Not occasional disciplinary measures, but regular, expected responses to any perceived failing. And the sexual abuse was rampant. Female servants had no protection whatsoever from the sexual predation of male nobles, knights, or even higher-status male servants. If a lord wanted a serving girl, she had no ability to refuse. If she became pregnant from these rapes, and calling them anything else is dishonest, she might be dismissed from service with no resources and nowhere to go. Or she might be kept on and forced to work until days before giving birth, then expected to return to work almost immediately after, possibly with an infant she had no way to care for. The food servants ate was whatever was left after everyone else had been fed. The scraps, the worst parts, the bits that were starting to rot. They might get one adequate meal a day if they were lucky. More often, they survived on bread, thin soup, and whatever they could sneak from the kitchen without being caught and beaten for theft. Their clothing was minimal, usually 1 or 2 sets of rough wool garments that were never adequate for the cold. They wore these clothes until they literally fell apart, then received cast-offs from higher status members of the household. Shoes were a luxury. Many servants went barefoot year-round, their feet developing thick calluses that cracked and bled in winter. Medical care was non-existent. If a servant became ill, they either recovered or they died. If they were injured while working, they received no treatment beyond what other servants might provide. Become too sick or too injured to work, and you might simply be turned out of the castle to fend for yourself. Your value was in your labor. When you couldn't work anymore, you had no value. The psychological toll of this existence is almost impossible to comprehend. You had no future beyond more of the same. No hope of improvement. No possibility of escape. You would serve until you died or became too old or injured to work, at which point you'd be discarded. Your children would grow up in the same servitude. This was your life, and there was no alternative, no way out, nothing to look forward to except more of the same grinding exploitation. And yet the castle couldn't function without these people. The nobles who lived in relative comfort did so entirely because of an invisible army of servants who worked themselves to exhaustion, who suffered in silence, who lived and died without anyone recording their names or acknowledging their existence as fully human. Some servants tried to resist. Small acts of sabotage, working slowly when they could get away with it, stealing food or small items. But the consequences of being caught were severe enough to keep most in line. You could be beaten so severely you couldn't work for days. You could be branded as a thief. In extreme cases, you could be hanged or mutilated. The power imbalance was absolute. This was life for the majority of people in the castle. Not the glamorous inhabitants whose stories get told, but the invisible multitude whose suffering made castle life possible for the privileged few. Now we enter the realm of paranoia, betrayal, and death by treachery, because castles weren't just military fortifications against external enemies. They were pressure cookers of political intrigue where your closest allies might be plotting your murder, where every meal could be poisoned, and where the person smiling at you across the dinner table might have already made arrangements for your assassination. Medieval politics was a blood sport, literally. The stakes were absolute: power, land, wealth, survival. Lose the game, and you didn't just lose your position, you lost your life, often along with your entire family. This created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and paranoia that poisoned every relationship and made genuine trust almost impossible. Poisoning was the weapon of choice for assassination because it could be done subtly, without the obvious violence of a stabbing or ambush. A little something in the wine, in the food, and days or weeks later, the target would sicken and die. Without modern toxicology, proving poisoning was nearly impossible. The victim's death could be attributed to natural causes, to God's will, to disease. The murderer could express public sorrow while privately celebrating their success. Common poisons included arsenic, which causes symptoms similar to cholera, vomiting, diarrhea, death from dehydration. Hemlock, which causes paralysis and respiratory failure. Various plant-based toxins extracted from nightshade, foxglove, and monkshood. These weren't difficult to obtain, they grew in gardens, in forests, in any castle's herb stores. A skilled poisoner could access them easily. This meant that every meal was potentially dangerous. Lords employed food tasters, people whose entire job was to eat a portion of the lord's meal first and then wait to see if they died. Imagine that job. Imagine being the person who has to eat potentially poisoned food, knowing that if someone has decided to kill your master, you're going to die first to warn them. Some food tasters were loyal servants. Others were expendable prisoners or slaves forced into the role. But poisoning wasn't the only threat. Castles were full of people carrying weapons, knights, men-at-arms, guards. An assassin could blend in easily. A disgruntled knight, bribed or coerced or personally motivated, could strike in a corridor, in a courtyard, anywhere there weren't enough witnesses. And in the dark, narrow passageways of a castle, with limited lighting and many hiding places, an assassin had numerous opportunities. The paranoia this created was toxic. You couldn't trust anyone completely. Your closest advisor might be selling information to your enemies. Your personal guard might have been bought off. The servant who brought your wine might have been threatened or bribed to add something to it. Even family members were suspect. There are countless historical examples of children killing parents, siblings killing siblings, spouses killing each other, all for power and wealth. This suspicion extended to every level of castle life. Nobles spied on each other constantly. Networks of informants passed along gossip, rumors, observations. Who was meeting with whom? Who was receiving mysterious visitors? Who seemed to be spending beyond their means, suggesting they might be taking bribes. Every action was scrutinized for signs of betrayal. Torture was used regularly to extract confessions from suspected plotters. And medieval torture was sophisticated in its cruelty, designed to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim alive and conscious. The rack, which stretched the body until joints dislocated. The boot, which crushed feet and ankles. Hot irons applied to flesh. Fingernails pulled out one by one. People confessed to anything under this treatment, which meant that innocents were regularly executed based on confessions extracted through unbearable pain. The consequences of being accused of treason or plotting against your lord were extreme. If you were fortunate, you might be executed quickly, beheaded, hanged. If you were less fortunate, your death would be designed as public entertainment and political theater. Drawn and quartered, dragged through streets, hanged until nearly dead, cut down and disemboweled while still alive, then cut into pieces. Burned alive. Flayed. Medieval executions were designed to terrify observers into obedience. And it wasn't just the accused who suffered. Families of traitors could be attainted, their property seized, their titles revoked, their children left with nothing. This created a collective punishment system where everyone had a stake in ensuring their relatives didn't plot against the Lord. Your father's treason could destroy your entire family's future. The psychological toll of living under this constant threat is difficult to overstate. You had to be constantly vigilant, constantly suspicious, constantly aware that today might be the day someone decided you were a threat that needed to be eliminated. Friendships were strategic calculations. Alliances were temporary arrangements. Everyone had agendas, everyone was maneuvering for advantage, and genuine human connection became nearly impossible. Some nobles became genuinely paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, trusting no one. Others became ruthlessly pragmatic, striking first before they could be struck against, eliminating potential threats preemptively. Both responses were rational adaptations to an environment where betrayal was common and deadly. Court intrigue wasn't exciting political maneuvering like in movies, it was psychological warfare that destroyed mental health and ended in real corpses. The smile you received might be covering murderous intent. The gift you accepted might be poisoned. The ally who pledged loyalty might already be planning your downfall. In this environment, genuine peace of mind was impossible. You lived in constant tension, constantly looking over your shoulder, constantly wondering if today was the day your luck ran out. Let's now confront one of the most whitewashed aspects of medieval castle life, the experience of women, particularly noblewomen who we often imagine as having privileged, comfortable existences. The reality was that these women lived in gilded cages, with virtually no control over their own lives, bodies, or destinies. A noblewoman's life was determined before she was even old enough to understand what was happening to her. Marriage was a political and economic transaction, nothing more. Girls were betrothed as young as 7 or 8 years old to men they'd never met, men who might be decades older, men chosen entirely based on political alliances and land arrangements. The girls' preferences, feelings, desires, these were irrelevant and often not even considered worth asking about. These marriages were consummated as soon as the girl reached puberty, sometimes even before. A 12-year-old girl might find herself in bed with a middle-aged man, expected to submit without complaint, with no understanding of what was happening and no ability to refuse. This was rape by any modern definition, but medieval society didn't recognize it as such. It was simply the husband claiming his rights over his property, because that's what a wife was, legally speaking. Property. The wedding night was often a public spectacle. In some cases, witnesses would literally stand in the bedroom to verify that the marriage was consummated. Imagine having your virginity taken by someone you barely know while other people watch. The trauma of this experience must have been devastating, but women were expected to endure it without complaint, to smile and play their role. Once married, a woman's primary function was to produce heirs. Male heirs, specifically, because daughters were seen as less valuable, useful only for marrying off to create more political alliances. A woman would become pregnant repeatedly throughout her childbearing years, facing that 1 in 50 chance of death with every pregnancy we discussed earlier. And between pregnancies, there was little recovery time. Women might be pregnant almost constantly from their early teens until their bodies simply couldn't take it anymore. Childbirth in medieval times was unimaginably dangerous. Labor could last for days. If complications arose, there was almost nothing that could be done. Babies positioned wrong in the womb might kill both mother and child. Hemorrhaging after delivery might drain a woman's life away while midwives watched helplessly. Infections would set in days after seemingly successful births, causing fever and death. Women wrote their wills before going into labor because they genuinely didn't know if they'd survive. If a woman survived her multiple pregnancies, she then faced the agony of watching many of those children die. Remember that child mortality rate, up to half of all children dead before age 5. A woman might give birth to 8 or 10 children and watch 6 or 7 of them die in childhood. The psychological trauma of this repeated loss, compounded by the expectation that she would simply get pregnant again immediately to replace the dead children, was crushing. Women had no legal existence separate from their husbands. Any property they brought to the marriage became their husband's. They couldn't make contracts, couldn't own land in their own right, couldn't make decisions about their own children. If their husband died, they might have some rights as a widow, but those rights were limited and could be revoked if they remarried, which they were often pressured or forced to do. Physical abuse was common and accepted. A man had the legal right to beat his wife for disobedience. The only restriction in some places was that he couldn't use a stick thicker than his thumb, the origin of the phrase, rule of thumb. Women who fought back could be severely punished. Women who tried to leave abusive marriages had nowhere to go and no legal recourse. Sexual consent within marriage didn't exist as a concept. A husband could demand sex whenever he wanted, regardless of his wife's health, pregnancy status, or desires. Refusing him was grounds for punishment and social condemnation. Women's sexuality was tightly controlled, they were expected to be virgin until marriage, then completely faithful afterward, while men faced no such expectations and could openly keep mistresses. Education for women was limited and focused on skills considered appropriate, needlework, household management, perhaps reading and writing if they were fortunate. Intellectual pursuits were discouraged or forbidden. A woman who showed too much intelligence or independence was viewed with suspicion and hostility. The ideal woman was obedient, quiet, focused entirely on serving her husband and bearing his children. For women who didn't fit this mold, options were extremely limited. Religious life in a convent was one of the few paths that offered some autonomy, but even this choice was often made for women rather than by them. Unwanted daughters might be sent to convents to get them out of the way. And convent life had its own restrictions and hardships. The few women who gained power, usually as widows or queens, had to navigate a world that fundamentally didn't believe women should have authority. They faced constant challenges to their legitimacy, constant attempts to marry them off to someone who would take control, constant criticism for exhibiting the same behaviors that were praised in men. Living as a noblewoman meant knowing you were fundamentally powerless. Your body wasn't yours. Your children weren't truly yours. Your property wasn't yours. Your future wasn't yours. You were a piece on a chessboard, moved around by others for their benefit, with no say in where you ended up or what happened to you. The gilded cage might have had comfortable furnishings, but it was still a cage, and the bars were unbreakable. Now we come to perhaps the most terrifying aspect of castle life, being under siege. This was the scenario every castle was built to survive, but the reality of a prolonged siege was so horrific that it's difficult to comprehend. When an enemy army surrounded your walls and settled in for a long siege, you weren't just trapped, you were sentenced to a slow death that might take months to arrive. The first sign that a siege was coming was usually refugees flooding in from surrounding villages. They'd seen the enemy approaching and fled to the castle for protection. In theory, this was what the castle was for, protecting the Lord's people. In practice, it meant suddenly having hundreds more mouths to feed from supplies that had been calculated for a much smaller population. The siege hadn't even begun, and the food situation was already dire. Once the enemy arrived and surrounded the castle, the gates would be sealed. That's it. No more going out. No more supply runs. Whatever you had inside the walls was all you were going to have until either the siege ended or everyone inside was dead. And medieval armies were patient. They knew starvation was their best weapon. They could wait. The first few weeks might not seem too bad. Supplies were adequate, morale was decent, everyone believed relief forces would arrive soon or the enemy would give up. But as weeks turned into months, the reality set in. Food rations were cut. Then cut again. Then cut again. What had been modest meals became starvation rations. People became focused entirely on food, thinking about it constantly, dreaming about it, willing to do almost anything for an extra scrap. Animals inside the walls were slaughtered and eaten, first the livestock brought in by refugees, then the horses, then the dogs. As supplies dwindled further, people ate leather, boiled to make it soft enough to chew. They ate rats, which at least were plentiful. They ate grass, tree bark, anything that might provide a few calories. And then came the diseases. Malnutrition weakens the immune system, making people vulnerable to every infection. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of a siege, disease spread like wildfire. Dysentery was common, causing severe diarrhea that accelerated dehydration and death. Typhus, carried by lice, killed thousands in siege situations throughout history. When people are starving, packed together, unable to maintain even basic sanitation, disease doesn't just spread, it explodes. Bodies piled up faster than they could be disposed of. In a normal situation, the dead would be buried outside the walls. During a siege, outside the walls was enemy territory. Bodies had to be buried inside, but that required energy that starving people didn't have and space that didn't exist. Bodies might be thrown into cellars, into unused rooms, anywhere they could be hidden. The smell of decay added to the already unbearable conditions. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and cruel. Besieging armies would sometimes catapult diseased corpses over the walls, spreading plague and terror simultaneously. They might parade captured prisoners where castle defenders could see them, then torture and execute them slowly to break the defenders' morale. They would cook food within sight and smell of the walls, torturing the starving people inside with reminders of what they couldn't have. Water could run out faster than food. If the castle's well went dry or became contaminated, people died of thirst within days. Some castles had their water supplies poisoned by attackers who found ways to access underground springs or aquifers. Dying of thirst is one of the most agonizing ways to die. Your body slowly shuts down, your mind becomes confused and desperate, every moment is suffering. As starvation reached its peak, desperate choices had to be made. Who would get the remaining food? The fighters, because they were needed for defense. The children, because they were innocent. The lord and his family, because they were the highest status. No answer was right, and every choice meant deciding who would die. And there are documented cases, more than we'd like to admit, of cannibalism during severe sieges. When every scrap of food was gone, when every rat had been caught, when people were dying anyway, some survivors ate the dead. It's one of the most taboo subjects in history, but it happened. The siege of Mahara during the First Crusade saw widespread cannibalism. The siege of Paris by Vikings in 885 to 886 saw similar horrors. Desperate hunger can break any moral boundary. Some people tried to escape. Sneaking out at night, trying to slip through enemy lines, hoping to reach friendly territory and bring back help. Most were caught and killed, often within sight of the castle walls as a message to those who remained. The bodies would be left to rot where defenders could see them, a reminder of what awaited anyone else who tried to leave. The siege would end in one of several ways. Relief forces might arrive and drive off the attackers, the best outcome, but also the rarest. The defenders might negotiate surrender terms, hoping for mercy. Sometimes they got it, sometimes they were massacred anyway. The attackers might breach the walls through mining, battering rams, or betrayal from within. This usually led to sacking of the castle and slaughter of inhabitants. Or everyone inside might simply die, leaving the attackers to walk through gates to a castle full of corpses. Surviving a siege left deep psychological scars. The months of starvation, terror, disease, and watching people die around you, this kind of trauma doesn't heal. Survivors would live with nightmares, with inability to feel safe even after the siege ended, with the knowledge that it could happen again at any time. Winter in a medieval castle was its own form of torture, a months-long ordeal that killed people just as surely as any siege, but slowly, grinding them down day by day until spring finally arrived. And this wasn't an exceptional hardship. This was every single year, a recurring nightmare that everyone knew was coming but could never fully prepare for. The cold was unimaginable by modern standards. Stone absorbs cold and radiates it inward. Those thick walls that protected against enemies became channels for freezing air that permeated every room. The temperature inside was often barely above the temperature outside, sometimes actually colder because at least outside you had sunlight. Inside, you lived in perpetual damp twilight that seeped into your bones and never left. People went to sleep in their clothes, under piles of furs and wool blankets, often sharing beds to cool body heat. Even with all of this, you might wake with frost in your hair, ice on the inside of the stone walls, your breath visible as clouds. Touching the walls could leave skin stuck to the frozen stone. Water in basins would freeze solid overnight. The cold was so pervasive that it became a constant background to every moment of existence. Fire provided some heat, but fuel was precious. Wood had to be gathered, chopped, and stored before winter hit. Run out of firewood, and people froze to death in their beds. So fires were kept small, barely adequate, feeding cold rather than banishing it. The great hall might have its central fire pit, but most rooms had no heating at all. You learned to live with cold as a permanent condition. Frostbite was common. Fingers, toes, ears, noses, extremities that couldn't be kept warm enough, would freeze. The tissue would die, turn black, eventually fall off or require amputation. People would lose fingers and toes every winter, considered almost normal casualties of the season. Worse was when frostbite became infected, leading to gangrene and death. Food supplies dwindled as winter progressed. Everything was rationed carefully, but no matter how careful the steward was, supplies always seemed inadequate by late winter. February and March were the worst, months when last year's harvest was depleted but this year's crops were still months from being ready. This was when starvation hit hardest, when the weakest members of the household died, when everyone else grew thin and weak. The isolation was psychologically devastating. Travel in winter was dangerous and often impossible. Snow blocked roads. Rivers froze, eliminating water transport. You were trapped inside the castle walls with the same people, day after day, week after week, month after month. Cabin fever set in, tensions rose, arguments became violent, the close quarters that were merely uncomfortable in summer became unbearable prisons in winter. Darkness compounded the isolation. In deep winter at northern latitudes, sunlight might be available for only a few hours per day. The rest of the time, you lived by candlelight or torchlight if you could afford it, or in darkness if you couldn't. The psychological impact of living in darkness for months cannot be overstated. Seasonal affective disorder, depression, hopelessness, these became endemic during winter months. Water sources could freeze. Wells might freeze solid, requiring people to chip away ice just to get water for drinking and cooking. Melting snow became necessary, but snowmelt still needed to be carefully managed because it required fuel to melt it, and fuel was precious. Every basic necessity became a calculated trade-off. The elderly died in winter. The very young died. Anyone already weakened by illness or malnutrition often didn't survive until spring. Winter was when the population shrank, when the weak were culled by cold and hunger. Families knew that some of their members wouldn't see another spring. The question was just who would make it and who wouldn't. Illness spread more easily when everyone was trapped inside together. Respiratory diseases thrived in the close quarters, coughing, sneezing, infected people sharing air with everyone else. Influenza would sweep through castle populations, killing the vulnerable. With everyone already weakened by cold and hunger, diseases that might have been survivable in summer became death sentences in winter. Animal husbandry became critical for survival. Livestock needed to be kept alive through winter because they were the breeding stock for next year and would provide fresh meat and dairy in spring. But feeding animals when humans were also hungry created terrible choices. Do you slaughter a breeding cow to feed people now, knowing it means less food next year? Do you let people starve while keeping animals alive? Every decision was impossible. The psychological weight of knowing that this would happen again next year, and the year after, and every year for the rest of your life, was crushing. Winter wasn't an unusual hardship, it was a guaranteed recurring torture that you survived if you were fortunate and strong, and didn't survive if you weren't. There was no escape, no alternative, just endurance. Some people didn't make it psychologically. Confined in darkness and cold for months, watching people die, never knowing if you'd see spring yourself, some people simply broke. Depression became so severe they lost the will to live. Some took their own lives. Others just gave up, stopped eating, stopped trying, and faded away. And even when spring finally arrived, it didn't bring immediate relief. Supplies were at their lowest. Food stores depleted. Everyone was weak from months of inadequate nutrition. The first warm days didn't mean abundance, they meant trying to survive a few more weeks until new crops could be harvested, new animals could be slaughtered. Spring was hope, but it was also the most dangerous time because you'd made it so far and might still die before the harvest came in. Winter in a medieval castle wasn't romantic. It was survival at its most desperate, recurring annually with terrifying regularity. So now we've walked through the reality. We've seen the filth, the hunger, the disease, the violence, the cold, the fear. Now we need to ask, how did we get from that brutal reality to the romantic fantasy most people believe about medieval castles? Why do we have this elaborate mythology about knights and ladies, about honor and chivalry, about a simpler, more noble time? Part of the answer is that the people who actually lived in castles wanted you to believe the mythology. They created it themselves, deliberately. The nobility needed to justify their position at the top of society. They needed to explain why they deserved to own the land, to rule over others, to take the best of everything while peasants starved. So they created elaborate systems of chivalric codes, stories of noble knights and virtuous ladies, narratives of honor and duty that made their power seem legitimate rather than simply taken by force. The literature of the medieval period, the romances, the epic poems, the legends, these weren't documenting reality. They were propaganda. When you read about King Arthur and his knights, about courtly love and noble quests, you're reading the medieval equivalent of advertising. These stories showed nobility as the upper classes wished to be seen, not as they actually were. It was fantasy even then, escapism for people living in the brutal reality we've described. The church reinforced these narratives because they benefited from the existing power structure. The concept of the three estates, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, was religious doctrine that justified inequality. Nobles fought, protecting everyone else. Clergy prayed, ensuring everyone's salvation. Peasants worked, supporting the other two. Everyone had their place in God's plan. Question that arrangement, and you were questioning God himself. Then, centuries later, the Romantic movement looked back at the medieval period and saw what they wanted to see. They were living through industrialization, factories, pollution, urban crowding, mechanization of life. The medieval period looked simpler by comparison. They imagined a time when life was more authentic, more connected to nature, less corrupted by modern concerns. They ignored or downplayed the actual conditions because those conditions didn't serve their narrative. Victorian-era writers and artists doubled down on the romanticization. They gave us the medieval world of fairy tales, white knights, beautiful princesses, magical quests. Children grew up on these stories. The mythology became embedded in popular culture so deeply that it overrode actual history in most people's minds. Modern media has continued and amplified this mythology. Fantasy novels, movies, video games, they almost all draw on romanticized medieval aesthetics. We see castles as magical, mysterious places. We see knights as heroes. We see medieval life as simpler and more meaningful than modern existence. The mythology has become so powerful that when people encounter actual medieval history, they often reject it as exaggerated or inaccurate because it doesn't match the fantasy they've been taught. But here's what actually happened in those castles: people suffered. Not occasionally, not in exceptional circumstances, but constantly, as a normal condition of existence. They lived in filth we can barely imagine. They ate food that would disgust us. They suffered from diseases we've eliminated. They died young, often in agony. Usually without ever experiencing what we would consider basic dignity or comfort. The vast majority of people in castles, the servants, the workers, had lives of pure exploitation. They were born into servitude and died in servitude, their entire existence dedicated to making life marginally less horrible for the small number of people at the top. And even those people at the top weren't living in luxury by any standard we'd recognize. They were just dying less quickly, suffering slightly less intensely. The violence was endemic. Not just during wars or sieges, but built into the structure of daily life. Beatings, executions, torture, rape, these weren't aberrations, they were standard features of how power was maintained. The medieval period was brutal in ways that should make us deeply grateful for every advance in human rights, medicine, sanitation, and social organization that has occurred since. Women had essentially no rights. Children died in shocking numbers. Disease killed without mercy. Hunger was a constant companion. The cold was inescapable. The smell was overwhelming. The psychological toll of living under constant threat, constant surveillance, constant exploitation was devastating. This was reality. So why does any of this matter? Why spend time destroying the fantasy? Because understanding the reality gives us perspective on how far humanity has come. Every modern convenience we take for granted, clean water, adequate food, medical care, heating, sanitation, human rights, represents a victory over conditions that were once universal. People suffered to achieve these advances. They fought, they died, they slowly built the foundations for a better world. The fantasy also obscures important truths about power and inequality. When we romanticize the medieval period, we risk romanticizing the power structures that made it so brutal. The idea that some people are just naturally meant to rule while others are meant to serve, that inequality is part of a divine plan, that suffering builds character, these are dangerous ideas that are easier to believe when we're not confronting the reality of what they actually meant. The medieval castle wasn't a place of romance and adventure. It was a survival mechanism in an age of endemic violence, and the people who lived there paid a terrible price for that survival. Understanding that reality, really understanding it, in all its brutal detail, makes us appreciate what we have now and motivates us to protect and expand the rights and standards that previous generations fought to establish. The fantasy is comfortable. The reality is horrifying. But the reality is true, and truth matters more than comfort.